Before we get too far underway, let me explain what we're going to do tonight. This morning in the sermon, I took us to Psalm 110, and we're coming back to that tonight, although I'm not going to give you a sermon per se, as I'm going to give you a follow-up study, a visual study, to give you some examples of some of the things that I mentioned this morning during the hour. So let's have the lights, if we can, have them dimmed. All right. There we go. So if you'd like, you can have your Bible open to Psalm 110, but you don't need to. I'm going to be projecting the text up there. This morning we were in this really rich passage, the 110th Psalm, Christ our King, our Priest, our Victor. And I'm going to give you a little, my own translation of this psalm. It's going to be very similar to the New American Standard that I preach from, but there are a few spots where I've made some slight changes. A psalm of David. And please note that whenever the Lord, the Father, is mentioned, I put that in blue, and whenever Messiah is referred to, I put it in red. Thus says Yahweh to my master, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Yahweh will extend your strong scepter from Zion. You shall rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will freely follow you in the day of your power, in the splendor of holiness. From the womb of the dawn, your youth is like the dew. Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Master enthroned at your right hand will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses. He will shatter the head over a broad country. He will drink from the brook by the wayside. Therefore he will lift up his head. This morning in our study, we noted that the psalm can be divided into three parts. It's summed up this way, that David foresees the Messiah enthroned as a divine king and a royal priest who will triumph as a holy warrior. And from this text, we are to be filled with a holy longing and holy loyalty to Jesus Christ. Verses 1 and 2, David's Lord is going to be enthroned as a divine king. We see in verse 1 the divine characters in session. We have Yahweh and David's Adonai, David's Lord. Two persons distinct from each other, sharing the heavenly throne. And then the divine honors are bestowed. There's an enthronement of the Lord and a prophecy about his ultimate victory and kingdom. And then in verses 3 and 4, the imagery seems to shift to be about him as a royal priest. This same king, divine king, is to be ordained as a royal priest. Verse 3 speaks about the appealing beauty of his holiness. He has a people who follow after him. And verse 4 speaks about the kingly authority of his priesthood. God himself has ordained him to have this unique role as king priest, just like Melchizedek was. And then the end of the psalm, verses 5 through 7, tells us that this king priest will be triumphant as a holy warrior. He will thoroughly vanquish all of his foes, and he will relentlessly pursue total victory. Now, in tonight's study, I want to talk about the main images of the Messiah that we have in the psalm. He is presented to us as king and priest and victor. And I'll also talk about the background images up from the ancient world. There are word pictures that David uses in this psalm that are kind of foreign to us, but they would have been very common to the mind of the Hebrews back in his day. Images such as thrones and throne footstools and treading out grapes and things, and dew and the brook. There are three main images that David sees about his Messiah, Master in Psalm 110, King, Priest, and Victor. The psalm apparently has three main sections which each focus on one of these different images. Verses 1 and 2, the Messiah will be a king. In verses 3 and 4, Messiah will be a priest. And in verses 5 through 7, Messiah will be a warrior. But each of these sections also brings up some of the other things. It overlaps with the others. And in verses 1 and 2, Messiah is a king, but the defeat of his enemies is also mentioned. In verses 3 and 4, Messiah is a priest, but he's also a king and a victor. In verses 5 through 7, Messiah is a victor, a champion, but he's also one who's been enthroned at the right hand of Yahweh. So while each of these sections emphasize a different image, they also overlap with each other in different ways. The chart on the next page shows that. Here's your three images in the psalm, and you can see from this little chart that they overlap with each other. Verse 1 focuses on him being king, but verse 1 and verse 2 also emphasize that he is a victor. He's a champion. He's a winner. He wins the day. Verse 3 focuses on him being king and victor and priest. Verse 4 focuses just on his priesthood, but the end of verse 4 mentions that he is both priest and king. And then verse 5, he is king and victor. And the end of the poem is mostly about him being a victor. So this little chart just shows how these different word pictures sort of mingle with each other as this psalm goes forward. Let me talk about some of the background images that would have been in the mind of Hebrews as they heard this poem back in David's day. Thus says Yahweh to my master in verse 1, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. To sit at the right hand of a king could mean more than one thing. It all depends on the setting in which it's said. If you were a guest of the king, then what might happen is in the royal chamber, there's the throne seated in the center, and an extra chair might be brought in and set next to him so that you would sit at the king's right hand. But there would not be any thought that you are reigning along with the king. It would just simply be that you are being honored. So, for instance, Solomon does this for Bathsheba one day when she attended his court. They have an extra chair brought in and she's seated at the right hand of the king. No one is thinking that she is taking over the throne or that she's sharing the throne. It's just a matter of honor. If one were enthroned, though, as a co-ruler, the king might actually, if you will, shimmy over a little bit on his big seat and share the throne with his viceroy, the one who is sharing the kingdom with him. In fact, this image, we actually have drawings of things like this from the ancient world. He might actually share his seat. Pagan kings, peoples like the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Assyrians and others, often envisioned themselves as sitting on the right hand of their gods. They might think that their god was the king of their land and that they shared the throne with their god. And they would actually sometimes make carvings and drawings of this. And this imagery is so well known in the ancient world that David's readers might well have thought something like the image that we're going to see on the next page. The image I'm going to show you on the next page comes from Egypt, about 2 or 3 centuries before David sat on his throne in Jerusalem. So this is a picture. On the left side is Pharaoh Horemheb. Horemheb is sitting on the left. And on the right side, to our right side, is one of the great Egyptian gods, Horus. So what this sculpture is supposed to represent is that Horus is the king of the land, but he's allowing Pharaoh to sit at his right hand. And I don't know if you can notice that Horus, the one on our right, he has his right hand sticking out. You see it? And he's like touching either the back of the Pharaoh or it has it on the leg of the Pharaoh. And that's supposed to be a symbol of that the God is giving this king his power. And he is ruling because of what the king has allowed him to do. Well, back in the psalm, we have here that the Lord of heaven, Yahweh, said to my Lord, my master, the Messiah, sit at my right hand. That God the Father is authorizing God the Son to share his throne after his ascension as they prepare for the kingdom to come to earth. There's also talk in verse 1 about a footstool. And I shared this morning that whenever you're a king, you've got your throne is always going to be elevated and up. And with seats that are really high, you've got to make something to put your feet on, or they dangle, and then it looks kind of funny. So as important as having a royal throne is, it was also important to have a royal footstool. This is a picture of King Sennacherib of Assyria, and he's sitting on a mobile throne. When he would travel around to different parts of the realm of the empire, or maybe even when he would accompany the troops to war, they would have a mobile throne, a miniature throne that was smaller than the one back in his grand palace. You'll notice that he's seated there high, elevated above everybody else, so high that he needs to have a footstool there on the bottom. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, says the psalm. The royal footstool was often a metaphor for the king's total control of his realm. If you have your enemies under your feet, that means they are so subdued, you don't need to hold them by the hand. You don't need to hold them, restrain them. They are so subdued you can rest your feet on them, and there's no concern about there being an uprising. Where you put your feet is a place of total control. And this is an image, this is an expression that was used all throughout the ancient world. And David borrows this imagery to describe what Messiah's conquest would be like. I'm going to show you a tomb drawing from Egypt from a period before that of David. Now, this is a young pharaoh. You see that what looks like a younger person sitting on the lap. The person seated on the throne, I should say the one on the left there, is Amenhotep II. So this might be the pharaoh of the days of Moses, the days of the Exodus, or at least shortly after the Exodus, when Israel starts to go into the land. So actually, he'd be the pharaoh after the Exodus, 1426. And this drawing shows him sitting on the lap of his nursemaid. So this is the woman entrusted with raising him up as a young boy. So he's young, he's not yet fully ascended to power, but notice what is under his feet. You see that? There are a bunch of people laying down, and his feet are sitting on them. These are his enemies, the enemies of the nation, and they have been made into his footstool. Now, this is not a photograph of an actual event. This is not something that would have, if you had a camera with you in the days of Amenhotep and walked into his royal chamber, you would not have seen an image like this. This is a symbolic vision of his control of all his enemies. In a collection of letters that various pharaohs wrote to subordinate rulers and kings in the region, the subordinates will always refer to the pharaoh with the highest honor, and they will call themselves part of the king's footstool. I'll give you another image of that. You can see it more clearly down here at the bottom. You can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different people. These are supposedly the kings of the nations around Egypt. And the image means they are under Egypt's control. So this is the kind of image that the people in David's day would think of when they hear that statement that the Lord is going to put the enemies under his feet. They will be subdued. That is, the kingdom of Messiah will be great and uncontested, and there is no successful rebellion against it. Under his feet. In the letter below that I'm going to quote from, there is an authority figure around Egypt named Rib-Hadad. He's the ruler of the city of Gublah. And he writes to Pharaoh to express his loyalty. He says, Rib-Hadad says to his lord, "Great king, the king of all countries, I fall at the feet of my lord, the king, 7 times and 7 times. Gublah is from ancient times the loyal city of my lord, the son of all countries, and I am a footstool for the feet of the king, my lord, and his loyal servant." Here's someone who's submissive to the Pharaoh and says, I am your footstool. There's another image, striking image, that we miss in our English Bibles in verse 2. Yahweh, David says, Yahweh will extend your strong scepter from Zion. You shall rule in the midst of your enemies. I shared with you this morning that this word for rule is not the normal Hebrew word for what a king does as he rules and reigns. In fact, this word is so unique, it kind of carries some of the imagery of the previous verse about enemies being under the feet. Because this word is an agricultural word used for plowing the field or even for treading grapes, for trampling grapes. The image of treading down one's enemies is one that's often used in the scriptures. And we even have a somewhat modern hymn that uses this language. I think many of us are familiar with the great battle hymn of the Republic, which uses the phrase, he is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Trampling. That's actually what this word means. You shall trample in the midst of your enemies. This is a picture from Egypt of slaves who are harvesting grapes. You can see the grape arbor over on the right side. And on the left side is a grape threshing floor. They've filled that with grapes, and you can see here in this picture they're holding on to ropes as they are treading the grapes. And of course that produces the grape juice or the wine that comes out here in the bottom side. The trampled grape juice will come out there, and that becomes a vat for the wine, and it's then collected. Of course, it's a messy affair, and it looks like blood. It isn't, but it looks like it. And so this became often an image of what happens when you have total victory. You tread your enemies down. There's no reason. What resistance can a grape give defeat? None at all. And so ultimately, the kingdom of Jesus Christ will be something that can't be resisted when he comes in his fullness and his glory and brings about the glorious day that's been promised. Amen. We come to verse 3, and there's another interesting image. As verse 3 begins to speak about the priestly nature of this Messiah, your people will freely follow you in the day of your power, in the splendor of holiness. From the womb of the dawn, the dew of your youth belongs to you. This phrase, "in the splendor of holiness," is actually used in the Old Testament in a number of different ways. It's often used to describe what priests and Levites looked like when they were decked out in their official robes and their vestments. It created an impressive sight that for all to behold, a lot like when we're impressed by seeing soldiers in their dress uniforms. The high priest of Israel would have worn garments somewhat like this. You'll notice the large stones there on his chest, different precious jewels which represented each one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Another artist has envisioned it looking somewhat like that. Down at the bottom of his garment are embroidered pomegranates. Jesus is not a priest like the descendants of Aaron, but he is nonetheless arrayed in holiness. He is a different sort of priest. He's a Melchizedekian priest. This verse describes in poetic terms what we've come to learn through the gospel about the beauty of Jesus. He is fitted with glory and honor, and he's able to accomplish for us what no other earthly priest could do. He is able to take away our sins completely. He is the perfect mediator between God and men. He is arrayed in glory and the splendor of his person. And sometimes in the book of Revelation, there are descriptions of him in his burning, glowing glory. Because of the inner change which God has sovereignly worked in our hearts, we find ourselves drawn to him. This verse says, your people will freely follow you in the day of your power. So he not only has enemies, he has people who lovingly follow him and will go anywhere he calls them to and are glad to be with him. And as we draw near to our royal priest, we experience the sanctifying benefits of his atoning work, which he has secured for us on the cross. Your people will freely follow you in the day of your power, in the splendor of holiness. And then that next phrase, from the womb of the dawn. From the womb of the dawn, the dew of your youth belongs to you. The womb of the dawn, that's a highly poetic phrase. And the idea is that the dawn, the early morning, as light breaks out and takes over the day, that's like a womb. That a new day is being birthed, that the darkness is coming to an end. So when he comes, the day of his power is going to be like some whole new day being birthed forth. He speaks of the dew of your youth. Dew, of course, comes in the time of the dawn, in the morning. This imagery is of early morning dew, birthed forth, as it were, by the dawn. Throughout the Bible, dew is a symbol of God's blessing and refreshment and renewal. Later on, the rabbis would say that the resurrection was like dew. They said there was a dew of resurrection, a vigor, a new life that would fall on all those whom God raised up to everlasting life. Messiah is someone who will be forever full of vigor. It's like he will be forever young. Never, every king of Israel, if he didn't die in battle or die of some disease, would grow old and older and oldest and finally would perish. David is still buried in a tomb somewhere in Jerusalem. Every other king after him as well. But Messiah is the king who never ages. He has forever the vigor of his youth. And he will reign and rule and lead his people forever and ever and ever. That's the day of his power. And it's something that will be birthed forth when our king priest comes again. And in case you don't remember what dew looks like, I want to tell you that this dew is from Israel, but it isn't. Dew is pretty much the same around the world. Well, there's a lot of things I could say about Melchizedek, but over the years I've said more than probably the Bible even says, so I'm going to leave that off for this evening. But I want to come to verse 7, the last verse in the poem. And there's a cryptic line. The line itself makes sense. It's just not always clear to everyone why it's mentioned where it is. After talking about the victory over his enemies, it says, he will drink from the brook by the wayside. Therefore he will lift up his head. This is another difficult verse. It's not because the words are difficult. It's just, what does this add to the description of the victory of Messiah? What is the drinking at this brook about? And there have been a few ideas. I might have mentioned two this morning. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. A few ideas have been proposed. One idea is that this is a ceremony that takes place when someone is enthroned. On the east side of Jerusalem, there is a spring, the Gihon spring. It was a vitally important part of the city. In fact, the original city was built around the Gihon spring. There's a great fortress that David conquered when he made the city his own. And we're told later on that when Solomon became king, that's where he went to be crowned. Maybe that's what's in view. Or maybe it means that the divine warrior, this champion, this victor, as he is pursuing his enemies to ultimate victory, will, on the way of pursuing after them, he won't stop and set up camp and gather up his water supply and all that. No, he'll just scoop up water as he goes and keep on after his enemies. So far, I'm more inclined to that view. Another view is that, well, after he has defeated his enemies, he takes time now to relax. He enjoys a drink. He savors the victory and the glory of the kingdom come in all its fullness. I want to come back to that first idea, though, and share with you where that's coming from, because it doesn't seem obvious that this is anything about being crowned, unless you know some things from the Old Testament. The first idea that this drinking by the brook is some kind of a ceremony for the king, it's difficult to prove, but it is interesting to consider. When David overthrew the city of Jerusalem, it had been called the city of Jebus, and David and his mighty men went down into the bottom of the Gihon spring, and they climbed up the 30 feet inside the water tower and then overtook the city. You can even go today to the water tower at where the original city of David was and see that waterwork. It's an amazingly impressive thing. David, when he overthrew the city, it was his men who first infiltrated the city at the Gihon spring, and they brought back water to David. You remember that? And David was so in such awe at their bravery and the risk that they took. They brought him a drink from the Gihon spring, and he poured it out on the ground as an offering to the Lord. He couldn't bring himself to drink it. This is the site that David chose years later for his son Solomon to be crowned as king. The Gihon spring lay very low in the eastern valley of the city. The Jebusites who had lived there for a long time had dug a deep shaft in the rock so that they could send down their buckets to get water without going out into the exposed country. Here's David's men scaled that water shaft to infiltrate the city. This is a picture of what Jerusalem would have looked like in David's day after he conquered it and expanded it somewhat. The original city of Zion is right there where the circle is. It's not very big, is it? So basically this lower part of the city, that is Zion. Zion is a word that means stronghold. It was a small city, and most of it was built around this spring, a spring that gushes something like 680 gallons of water a day. There's no river in Jerusalem. To get water, you need a spring, and they guarded it as strong as they could. And that place is so significant that when David, after he conquered the city and he had ruled there for some time, he chose that as the place where Solomon would be crowned. This place was lost to modern knowledge until it was rediscovered in 1867 by an archaeologist named Warren. And so now they have named it Warren's Shaft. And this is being down at the bottom. You're looking up the well, up into the city, toward the city of Jerusalem, and here it is looking down the other way. This is what David's men climbed up to overtake the city. So it's a very important part in Israel's history. This is where the city of Zion first came to belong to the people of the Hebrews. And so this was the place that when it was time for Solomon to take over the reign from his son, he brought him to that place. 1 Kings 1, verses 32 to 35. Then King David said, "Call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada." They came into the king's presence. The king said to them, "Take with you the servants of your Lord, and have my son Solomon ride on my own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. Let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there as king over Israel, and blow the trumpet and say, 'Long live King Solomon.' Then you shall come up after him, and he shall come and sit on my throne and be king in my place, for I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and Judah." So some have wondered, is it possible when Solomon was crowned as king that he dipped his hand down into the Gihon spring and took a drink of that important water as a token of the rule which had been given to him? Can't say for certain. It's possible that David envisions Messiah doing the same. Messiah, who currently reigns in heaven, will one day come to bring his kingdom to earth, and Jerusalem again will be the center of of the joy and glory of all the earth. Well, whatever the brook is about, the good news is from this psalm is that Christ, that is the Messiah, is our King. He's our priest. And he's our victor. And he's going to win the day. Our Lord, we thank you for the time we've had tonight to look at these images from the ancient world, images that would have been much more familiar to people like David and those who read and heard this psalm in ancient days. We thank you what it says about not David or even his son Solomon, but about his greatest son, Jesus Christ, the one you ordained to rule and to reign, the one you ordained to come to save a people, to be his, a people who would freely follow him and go wherever he goes, and do whatever he says, and lovingly rejoice in him and the victory that you've given. We thank you, Lord, that you have made us partakers in the victory of Jesus, that he has already won the greatest battle. He has won the victory over death. He has defeated death for us. He has defeated sin for us. He has brought us into his victory. And while we wait for him to come and for the fullness of his victory to be seen, we take great encouragement in knowing that we are on the victor's side. So, Lord, this week, as we go out into the world round about us, as we interact with our workmates and our neighbors and our schoolmates and the others who come our way, help us to know that you have fitted us, outfitted us to win the day. And that we have the mission of spreading the good news that good King Jesus is a saving priest who is coming again. All this we pray in Christ's